What if the words you speak every day are secretly destroying your relationships and sabotaging your success? 2,000 years ago, Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in Rome, discovered 7 specific phrases that poison our minds and push people away. These ancient warnings are more relevant today than ever, as modern psychology confirms what the Stoics knew all along, that certain words can literally rewire our brains for failure. In the next few minutes, you'll discover these 7 forbidden phrases and learn the powerful alternatives that can transform your communication forever. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment where in the world you're watching from, because now I'm going to tell you everything. Have you ever noticed how some important conversations fall apart within the first 30 seconds? You're trying to resolve an issue with someone you care about, and suddenly you find yourself in a full-blown argument instead. The frustrating part? You can't even pinpoint exactly where things went wrong. This isn't a coincidence. In fact, it's happening far more often than most of us realize. Recent research from communication psychology reveals something truly alarming. The average person uses at least one relationship-damaging phrase in 87% of important conversations. Even more concerning, we typically don't recognize these phrases as harmful because they've become normalized in our everyday speech. These aren't obvious insults or deliberate attacks. They're subtle linguistic traps that we've all fallen into, phrases so common that they've become invisible to us, yet powerful enough to derail even the most well-intentioned discussions. Let me show you a quick experiment that demonstrates just how powerful our word choices can be. Imagine someone approaches you and says, "You never listen to me when I talk about important things." Notice how your body instantly reacts. Most people feel a slight tension, a defensive energy rising. Now imagine they instead said, "I've noticed I've felt unheard during our last few conversations about household finances." Feel the difference? The second approach almost invites collaboration rather than defense. This tiny shift in language can completely transform how people respond to you. And it's not just modern psychology that recognizes this power. The ancient Stoics were perhaps the first to document it systematically. When I first discovered the work of Marcus Aurelius, I was struck by how much time this Roman emperor, perhaps the most powerful man in the world during his lifetime, devoted to analyzing his own communication failures. In his private journals, later published as Meditations, Marcus regularly chastised himself for speaking without thinking, using accusatory language, and failing to express himself with clarity and compassion. One particularly revealing passage reads, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" Marcus wasn't writing abstract philosophy. He was desperately trying to solve the exact same communication problems we face today. As emperor, his words could literally start wars or create peace, yet in his private thoughts, he agonized over conversations gone wrong, just like we do. In one entry, he writes about losing his temper with a servant, using harsh words that he immediately regretted. He noted how the damage of his poorly chosen words far exceeded the minor inconvenience that triggered them. The most powerful man in the world, struggling with the same communication challenges we face every day. What's fascinating about the Stoics is that they weren't perfect sages floating above human problems. They were real people struggling with the same communication challenges we face. Their philosophy wasn't abstract theorizing, it was practical problem-solving for everyday life. For the next 60 seconds, I want you to reflect on your last difficult conversation. Think about specific moments where things escalated or the other person seemed to shut down. What exact phrases might have contributed to the breakdown? Were there particular words that seemed to trigger defensiveness? Just take a moment to reflect. Through years of studying both Stoic texts and modern communication research, I've identified 7 specific phrases that consistently destroy connection before conversations even have a chance to develop. These phrases share one critical feature. They externalize control, making us feel and appear powerless in our own lives. The first toxic phrase, one we've all used countless times, is, "You make me feel." Whether it's, "You make me angry" or "You make me anxious," this phrase commits what the Stoics called a fundamental error in logic. No one can make you feel anything. Your emotions are internal responses to external events. When you say, "You make me feel frustrated," you're linguistically surrendering your emotional sovereignty, exactly what Marcus Aurelius warned against. You're telling both the other person and your own subconscious mind that your feelings are controlled by others rather than by your own interpretations and responses. Let's do a quick test to see how prevalent this pattern might be in your own life. Think about the last 3 times you felt a strong negative emotion in a relationship. How did you express it? Did you use phrases like, "You made me feel," or "Because of you, I feel"? Most of us do this habitually without even realizing it. Here's the paradox of communication that the Stoics understood so well. The more we blame others for our emotions, the less likely they are to change the behaviors we're concerned about. When you say, "You make me angry," the natural response is defensiveness, not reflection or change. According to research from the Harvard Negotiation Project, people who eliminate victim language from their vocabulary show measurable increases in perceived competence and trustworthiness. When researchers analyzed successful negotiation transcripts, they found that those who used personal agency language secured better outcomes by a margin of 28%, regardless of their actual position of power. I witnessed this transformation firsthand with a team leader I worked with named James. His team meetings were consistently tense, with team members disengaged and resistant. During our coaching sessions, I noticed how often he used phrases like, "You guys make it impossible to meet deadlines," and "Your delays make me look bad to management." We worked on shifting his language to take ownership of his responses. His new communication pattern became, "I feel concerned when deadlines are missed because it impacts how our entire department is perceived." This simple shift, taking ownership of his feelings while still addressing the behavior, completely transformed how his team responded. Within 3 weeks, team participation increased, defensive responses decreased, and they started meeting deadlines consistently. The change wasn't in the team, it was in how James communicated with them. By eliminating this one toxic phrase, he changed the entire dynamic. Here's what I'm promising you. In just 7 days, you can completely reprogram how people respond to you by eliminating these 7 toxic phrases from your vocabulary and replacing them with their Stoic alternatives. The transformation won't be subtle. You'll see immediate differences in how others react to even difficult messages. I should be honest, though. At first, these new phrases might feel artificial, almost like learning a new language. When I first started practicing Stoic communication principles, I felt awkward and unnatural. The first time I replaced "You're making this difficult" with "I'm finding this challenging." In a tense work situation, I felt self-conscious. But the change in response was immediate and undeniable. The person I was speaking with visibly relaxed and became more open to finding a solution together. Before we dive deeper into these toxic phrases and their alternatives, it's important to understand why these words have so much power over us and our relationships. The Stoics discovered something fascinating about our minds, something modern neuroscience has confirmed only recently. When someone uses accusatory language toward you, it activates what neuroscientists call the amygdala hijack, a threat response that shuts down the rational part of your brain and puts you in fight or flight mode. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for logical thinking and empathy, literally goes offline when we feel attacked. This is why conversations escalate so quickly when these toxic phrases enter the picture. Think about the last time someone used the phrase "you always" or "you never" with you. How did it make you feel? Open to their perspective, ready to collaborate, or instantly defensive? The physical reaction you experienced wasn't a choice. It was an automatic neurological response to perceived threat. The 7 toxic phrases we'll explore together activate this exact response in others. When you use them, you're unintentionally triggering the other person's threat response system, making productive conversation nearly impossible. No wonder so many important discussions fall apart. The Stoics were remarkably ahead of their time in understanding this connection between language and emotional response. Epictetus, who rose from slavery to become one of history's most influential philosophers, taught his students to carefully examine their language patterns as a core practice of wisdom. First, learn the meaning of what you say, he advised, and then speak. Epictetus understood that our careless words often create the very problems we then have to solve. He recognized that by the time words leave our mouths, they've already shaped our thinking in ways that either expand or limit our possibilities. The good news is that just as certain phrases can trigger defensiveness and disconnect, other phrases can create openness and collaboration. By replacing these 7 toxic phrases with their Stoic alternatives, you're not manipulating others. You're creating the neurological conditions for productive conversation. As we explore these phrases together, I encourage you to approach this as a practical experiment rather than a theoretical exercise. Don't just intellectually agree or disagree. Actually try replacing these phrases in your next conversation and observe what happens. The results will speak for themselves. The Stoics emphasized the importance of practical application over theoretical knowledge. As Seneca wrote, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, meaning that our anticipatory anxiety about changing our communication patterns is often worse than the actual experience of doing so. The slight discomfort of adopting new phrases is nothing compared to the ongoing pain of miscommunication and conflict. Each of the 7 toxic phrases we'll explore shares a common problem. They violate what the Stoics called the dichotomy of control. This core Stoic principle differentiates between what we can control, our judgments, actions, and words, and what we cannot control, others' perceptions, reactions, and choices. When your language blurs this crucial distinction, claiming others control your emotions or making sweeping generalizations about their behavior, you create confusion and conflict. But when your language respects this boundary, clearly owning what's yours and acknowledging others' autonomy, you create clarity and connection. The most powerful aspect of this transformation is how it affects not just how others respond to you, but how you feel about yourself. When you stop using language that externalizes control, you make me feel. You actually begin to experience greater personal agency in all areas of life. The Stoic approach to communication isn't about manipulating others or using clever tricks. It's about expressing yourself in ways that align with reality and maintain your personal agency. It's about choosing words that open possibilities rather than close them. But there's a crucial difference between the Stoic approach and modern communication hacks. The Stoics weren't interested in manipulation tactics or superficial techniques. Their goal was alignment with truth and personal integrity. The beauty of their approach is that it works precisely because it's rooted in a more accurate understanding of human psychology and relationships. The dichotomy of control is the key to all transformative communication. There exists a crucial difference between what happens to us and our response to it. It's what Epictetus, a former slave who became freer than his master, called the dichotomy of control. And when you apply this principle to your communication, something almost magical happens in your very next conversation. The dichotomy of control is the key to all transformative communication. There exists a crucial difference between what happens to us and our response to it. It's what Epictetus, a former slave who became freer than his master, called the dichotomy of control. And when you apply this principle to your communication, something almost magical happens in your very next conversation. Imagine being in the middle of a heated argument. Your heart is racing, your jaw is clenched, and you're about to say those words, "You make me so angry." Stop for a moment. What if I told you that this single phrase is actually giving away your power? That by saying someone else makes you feel something, you're surrendering control over the one thing no one can take from you, your own responses. This is precisely what Epictetus understood when he was physically abused by his master. Despite being chained and beaten, Epictetus discovered something revolutionary. While he couldn't control his external circumstances, he maintained absolute sovereignty over his internal responses. Make the best use of what is in your power, he taught, and take the rest as it happens. The first transformation we need to make in our language is shifting from "you make me feel" to "I feel" when this happens. This subtle change isn't just semantic, it's revolutionary. When you say, "I feel frustrated when meetings start late," instead of "you make me frustrated when you're late," you're reclaiming ownership of your emotional responses while still communicating your experience clearly. Let's practice this right now. Think of a recent situation where you felt negative emotions because of someone else's actions. How did you express it? Did you say something like, "You made me feel disrespected," or "you stressed me out"? Now, rewrite that sentence using the pattern, "I felt emotion," when objective description of what happened. Notice how different it feels. You're no longer positioning yourself as a passive victim of someone else's actions. Try rewriting these 3 common phrases. "You make me anxious when you drive so fast." "You made me feel stupid in that meeting." "You make me feel ignored when you're on your phone." Did you transform them? The restructured sentences might look something like, "I feel anxious when the car goes above the speed limit." "I felt embarrassed when my idea was dismissed in the meeting." "I feel disconnected when there's a phone between us during conversation." The Stoics visualized this principle as 2 concentric circles. The inner circle contains everything within your control, your judgments, your actions, your words, your tone of voice. The outer circle contains everything beyond your control, other people's reactions, traffic delays, weather, and countless other externals. True peace comes from investing your energy in the inner circle while accepting the outer circle as it comes. When you say, "You make me feel," you're linguistically placing your emotions in the outer circle, beyond your control. But that's simply not accurate. Your emotions always remain in the inner circle, generated by your interpretations of external events. I worked with a client named Sandra, let's call her that for our example, who transformed a toxic relationship dynamic with her partner through this single change. For years, their arguments followed the same pattern. "You make me feel unappreciated," followed by defensive responses and counter-accusations. When Sandra shifted to, "I feel unappreciated when housework I've done goes unnoticed," something remarkable happened. Her partner, instead of becoming defensive, became curious. The conversation shifted from blame to understanding, creating space for actual change. The neuroscience behind this shift is fascinating. When someone hears, "You make me," their brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, activates, triggering defensive responses. Blood actually flows away from their prefrontal cortex, where rational thinking happens, and into the limbic system, where fight or flight responses originate. By removing the accusatory "you keep their rational brain engaged, making productive conversation possible. Let me ask you something. Which of these statements would make you more open to a difficult conversation? "You make me feel disrespected when you interrupt me." "I feel disrespected when I'm interrupted mid-sentence." Most people intuitively recognize that the second approach feels less accusatory and more approachable. Yet in the heat of emotional moments, we default to the first pattern without realizing it. This transformation extends beyond face-to-face conversations. Think about text messages or emails you send when you're upset. How often do they contain hidden "you make me" accusations? Your late report made me miss my deadline could become "I missed my deadline when the report arrived later than expected." The second approach opens the door to problem solving rather than blame. In workplace settings, this shift is particularly powerful. When giving feedback, compare these approaches. "Your disorganization makes me frustrated," versus "I feel concerned when project files aren't systematically organized." The first approach almost guarantees defensiveness, while the second invites collaboration on a solution. Leaders who master this distinction consistently report higher team engagement and less resistance to feedback. I challenge you to try this for 24 hours. Eliminate "you make me feel" from your vocabulary completely. Replace each instance with "I feel emotion" when objective description. Pay attention to how differently people respond to you. Many workshop participants report that this single change creates immediate improvements in their most challenging relationships. There are subtle ways this blame pattern sneaks into our language, even when we're trying to avoid it. Phrases like "because of you I feel" or "your behavior causes me to feel" are just variations of the same externalization. The key question is, are you linguistically placing responsibility for your feelings outside yourself? Here's a practical tip. Watch for trigger words that signal you're externalizing responsibility. Words like "makes," "causes," "forces," or phrases like "thanks to you" often precede emotional blame. When you catch yourself using these triggers, pause and reformulate your thought. Of course, you'll encounter situations where others use blame language with you. When someone says "you make me angry," resist the temptation to respond in kind. Instead, model responsible language. "I hear that you're feeling angry. Can you help me understand what happened?" This response acknowledges their emotion without accepting blame for causing it. As you practice this new pattern, you're actually retraining your brain to recognize your agency in emotional situations. You're building what the Stoics called the discipline of assent, the ability to consciously choose your responses rather than reacting automatically. Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline every morning, writing in his journal, "Today I shall meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, malicious, and unsocial. All this has afflicted them through their ignorance of true good and evil. But I have seen the nature of good, and know it is beautiful, and the nature of evil, and know it is ugly. And so none of them can harm me, for no one can implicate me in ugliness." He wasn't denying that others' actions could be challenging. He was affirming that his emotional response remained within his control. This is the essence of emotional sovereignty that the Stoics practiced and taught. The transformation extends beyond your communication with others. As you practice ownership of your emotions in your external dialogue, you'll notice changes in your internal dialogue as well. That critical inner voice that says they make you feel inadequate begins to shift toward "you're feeling inadequate in response to this situation." This awareness creates space between stimulus and response, what modern psychologist Viktor Frankl called the space in which our power to choose our response lies. In that space lives your freedom. When you consistently practice this shift in language, people begin responding to you differently. Not because you're manipulating them, but because you're communicating more accurately. You're no longer triggering their defensive reactions, so they can actually hear what you're saying. Remember that this isn't about denying the impact of others' actions. It's about accurately representing the process of emotion. Others' actions are stimuli. Your emotions are your responses to those stimuli. Maintaining this distinction in your language keeps you firmly rooted in your personal power. I've seen this simple shift transform long-standing conflicts in families, workplaces, and intimate relationships. One client described it as removing the invisible wall that was always between us. When blame disappears from communication, connection becomes possible. The poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was deeply influenced by Stoic ideas, captured this principle beautifully. No one can bring you peace but yourself. Similarly, no one can make you feel anything. Your emotions are always your own, arising from your interpretations and values. Consider how differently you might approach difficult situations if you truly embodied this principle. Traffic delays wouldn't make you frustrated. You'd feel frustration in response to unexpected delays. Your colleague's oversight wouldn't make you angry. You'd feel anger in response to impacts on your work. This isn't mere wordplay. It's a fundamental shift in how you experience reality. As Epictetus taught, it's not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that matters. Your language should reflect this truth. When it does, you reclaim the power that is rightfully yours, the power to choose your responses in every situation. But there's another phrase that causes even more damage: the words always and never. When Seneca, the most influential advisor in Rome, recognized the destructive impact of these absolutes, he developed a technique called specific observation that transforms accusations into productive conversations immediately. Let me show you how it works. But there's another phrase that causes even more damage: the words always and never. When Seneca, the most influential advisor in Rome, recognized the destructive impact of these absolutes, he developed a technique called specific observation that transforms accusations into productive conversations immediately. Let me show you how it works. Imagine hearing someone say to you, "You never listen to me." How does your body instantly respond? Most people feel a sudden tightening in their chest, a defensive energy rising. Your brain isn't processing the content of the criticism. It's responding to the absolute nature of the accusation, because deep down, you know it's not true. You have listened sometimes, maybe even often. Being painted with this absolute brush feels fundamentally unfair. The absolute terms always and never are perhaps the most common toxic phrases in our everyday language. What makes them so destructive is that they're almost always, ironically, untrue. No one always does anything. No one never does something. These absolutes instantly trigger defensiveness because they contradict our lived experience. Seneca understood this psychological dynamic nearly 2,000 years ago. In his letters to his friend Lucilius, he cautioned against what he called the error of generalization, our tendency to take specific instances and expand them into universal patterns. The mind that is anxious about future events is miserable, he wrote. But equally miserable is the mind that distorts reality through sweeping generalizations. When you tell your partner you always leave your clothes on the floor, you're not describing reality accurately. What you mean is, "I've noticed clothes on the floor several times this week." The difference might seem subtle, but the impact on conversation is enormous. The first statement invites denial and defense. The second invites acknowledgement and potential change. This is where Seneca's technique of specific observation becomes transformative. Instead of making sweeping generalizations, describe precisely what you've observed. Replace "you never help with housework" with "I've noticed I've been doing the dishes alone for the past 3 evenings." This specificity makes it much harder to dismiss and much easier to address the actual issue. Try this quick exercise. Think of a complaint you have about someone in your life that you might express using always or never. Now, rewrite it as a specific observation. Instead of "you never call me back," try "I noticed I left 2 messages last week that weren't returned." Feel the difference. The second version is harder to argue with because it's factually specific rather than emotionally absolute. Modern conflict resolution research confirms the wisdom of this approach. Studies show that relationships improve by 43% when partners eliminate absolutes from their communication. Why? Because specific observations stay rooted in shared reality, while absolutes push conversations into emotional distortions. I remember working with a couple who came to me on the verge of separation. Their conversations had devolved into a predictable pattern. "You always criticize me," followed by, "You never appreciate what I do." When I asked them to replace these absolutes with specific observations, their entire dynamic shifted. "I felt criticized when you commented on my driving yesterday, and I noticed I haven't heard appreciation for the 3 dinners I cooked this week," created space for actual dialogue rather than defensive posturing. The Stoics emphasized the importance of seeing reality clearly without the distortions of our emotional judgments. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "Don't tell yourself anything more than what your primary impressions report." In modern terms, this means sticking to observable facts rather than emotional extrapolations. The transformation from absolutes to specific observations follows a simple formula. "I've noticed that specific behavior happened, specific time frequency." This approach has several powerful effects. First, it's harder to dispute. When you say, "You always interrupt me," the other person immediately scans their memory for counterexamples, which they'll almost certainly find. But when you say, "I noticed you interrupted me 3 times during our lunch conversation today," the specificity makes defensive responses less likely. Second, it creates clearer pathways to resolution. Absolutes, "You never clean up," offer no clear action steps. Specific observations, "I've noticed dishes in the sink from breakfast still there in the evening 3 times this week," naturally suggest specific solutions. Third, it maintains connection while addressing issues. Absolutes feel like character attacks. Specific observations focus on behaviors without condemning the whole person. Let's try another exercise. Imagine you're frustrated with a colleague who's late to meetings. Instead of saying, "You're always late," how could you reframe this as a specific observation? Take a moment to formulate your response. A transformed statement might be, "I've noticed you've arrived 5 to 10 minutes after our scheduled start time for the past 3 team meetings." This statement is factual, specific, and much more likely to lead to a productive conversation about punctuality. But what about when you're on the receiving end of these absolutes? When someone says, "You never listen to me," resist the temptation to counter with your own absolute, "That's not true. I always listen." Instead, try responding with, "I want to understand better. Could you share a specific recent time when you felt I wasn't listening?" This invites the person to move from generalization to specificity, creating space for actual resolution. This specific observation technique isn't just for conflicts. It's equally powerful when giving feedback or expressing appreciation. Compare, "You're always so helpful," with, "I really appreciated how you stepped in to help with the presentation yesterday when I was struggling with the technology." The second statement feels more genuine and impactful precisely because of its specificity. The Stoics recognize that our language habits shape our perception of reality. When you habitually use absolutes, you actually begin seeing the world in distorted, all-or-nothing terms. By practicing specific observations, you retrain your brain to perceive more accurately, which improves not just your communication, but your overall relationship with reality. Let me share a practical exercise that has helped thousands of workshop participants eliminate absolutes from their vocabulary. For the next 24 hours, commit to monitoring your language for always and never statements. Each time you catch yourself about to use one, pause and ask, "What specifically am I observing? When exactly did this happen? How often has it actually occurred?" Then reformulate your statement with that specificity. Many people are shocked to discover how frequently these absolutes appear in their everyday speech. One workshop participant counted 17 always, never statements in a single day of normal conversation. This awareness alone often creates significant change in communication patterns. There's a deeper Stoic principle at work here. Epictetus taught that many of our negative emotions arise from faulty judgments about reality. When you say, "You never appreciate me," you're not just expressing a complaint. You're reinforcing a distorted view of reality that causes you suffering. By shifting to, "I noticed I haven't heard appreciation for the extra work I did this week," you're aligning your language more closely with reality, which naturally reduces emotional distress. This practice extends beyond how you talk about others to how you talk about yourself. How often do you use absolutes in your self-talk? "I always mess things up," or "I never get things right," are just as damaging when directed inward. The antidote is the same: specific observations about your actual behaviors rather than sweeping judgments about your character. Seneca emphasized the importance of this self-examination. "I will keep constant watch over myself and, most usefully, will review my day." This daily review wasn't meant to be punitive, but clarifying, a way to see his own behaviors more accurately. When you replace "I always procrastinate" with "I noticed I delayed starting that report for 3 days this week," you create space for actual change rather than self-condemnation. This shift from absolutes to specifics might seem simple, but its effects ripple through all of your relationships. Parents who eliminate always, never statements often report dramatic improvements in communication with their children. Rather than "You never clean your room," try "I've noticed your room has had clothes on the floor for the past 3 days." The first approach triggers defensive shutdown. The second invites problem solving. Similarly, in romantic relationships, eliminating absolutes often breaks entrenched negative patterns. Rather than "You always prioritize work over me," try "I've noticed we haven't had an uninterrupted dinner together in 2 weeks." This specificity creates an opening for genuine conversation rather than defensive counter-accusations. The practice of specific observation connects directly to what the Stoics called living in accordance with nature, aligning our perceptions and expressions with reality as it actually is, not as our emotional distortions paint it. When your language reflects concrete reality rather than emotional generalizations, you create the conditions for genuine understanding. Think about a relationship in your life that feels strained right now. I'd be willing to bet that absolute statements play a significant role in that tension. What might change if you committed to eliminating always and never from your communication in that relationship for just 1 week? The beauty of this approach is that you don't need the other person's cooperation to begin transforming the dynamic. When you shift from "You never listen to me" to "I noticed I felt unheard when I brought up my concern about finances yesterday," you create an opening for different response patterns, regardless of whether the other person is practicing the same techniques. As you practice specific observations, you'll likely encounter what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, our tendency to attribute others' behaviors to their character. "You're so inconsiderate," rather than to circumstances. "You might have been particularly stressed yesterday." Specific observations help counteract this error by focusing on behaviors in particular contexts, rather than making sweeping character judgments. Remember that the goal isn't to eliminate all expressions of frustration or concern. The Stoics weren't advocating emotional suppression, they were teaching accurate expression. You can still communicate when something is important or when a pattern is concerning. The difference is that you'll do so in a way that corresponds to reality and opens possibilities for change rather than shutting them down. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Absolutes like always and never rarely represent the full truth of any situation. By committing to specific observations, you're practicing the Stoic virtue of wisdom, seeing and speaking about reality as it actually is. But there's a phrase that seems innocent, yet contains a hidden accusation so powerful that it can destroy trust instantly. It's the question, why can't you just? Marcus Aurelius considered it so dangerous that he developed a specific technique to replace it. When you master this transformation, you'll see doors opening where before there were only walls. But there's a phrase that seems innocent, yet contains a hidden accusation so powerful that it can destroy trust instantly. It's the question, why can't you just? Marcus Aurelius considered it so dangerous that he developed a specific technique to replace it. When you master this transformation, you'll see doors opening where before there were only walls. Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a conversation, frustrated by what seems like someone's intentional difficulty, and heard yourself saying, "Why can't you just be on time?" Or, "Why can't you just follow the instructions?" The moment those words leave your mouth, you can almost see the other person's defenses rise. What began as a simple request has suddenly transformed into an accusation of incompetence or deliberate obstruction. This seemingly innocent question carries a hidden payload. When we say, "Why can't you just?" what we're really communicating is, this should be simple, and you're deliberately choosing to make it difficult. It positions the other person as either incompetent or malicious, neither of which opens the door to productive conversation. Marcus Aurelius understood this psychological dynamic deeply. In his personal journals, he repeatedly reminded himself to avoid assuming bad intentions in others. "When you wake up in the morning," he wrote, "tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil." But then he immediately corrects himself, recognizing the error in this thinking. "But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own." This shift in perspective, from assuming others are deliberately difficult to recognizing our shared human nature, forms the foundation of what I call the technique of genuine curiosity. Instead of asking, "Why can't you just be on time?" which presumes deliberate difficulty, try, "I'm curious what challenges you're facing with the schedule." This opens space for understanding rather than defensive justification. Think about the last time someone asked you a "why can't you just" question. Perhaps it was a manager asking, "Why can't you just meet the deadline?" Or a partner wondering, "Why can't you just remember to call when you'll be late?" Remember how it felt, that instant need to defend yourself, explain why it wasn't that simple, or counterattack. That reaction isn't a choice, it's a neurological response to perceived accusation. Neuroscience shows us exactly why this happens. When someone feels accused, their brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, activates instantly. Blood flow actually shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, where problem-solving happens, and toward the limbic system, where defensive reactions originate. In simple terms, the accusatory nature of "why can't you just" makes it physiologically impossible for the other person to engage in collaborative problem-solving. Let's try a quick exercise. Think of a recent situation where you felt frustrated with someone and might have used a "why can't you just" phrase. Now, reframe it as a question of genuine curiosity. Instead of "why can't you just respond to emails promptly?" try, "I'm curious what your email management process looks like right now." Feel the difference? The first demands justification. The second invites shared understanding. Seneca, another great Stoic philosopher, emphasized this approach in his essay On Anger. He advised, "We should be neither credulous nor incredulous." In other words, we shouldn't immediately believe our frustrated interpretations of others' behaviors, nor should we dismiss our concerns entirely. Instead, we should approach with curious investigation, what modern psychologists might call suspending judgment to gather more information. This transformation follows a simple pattern. Replace "why can't you just" with "I'm curious about" or "help me understand." This shift does something remarkable. It positions you as a collaborative problem solver rather than an accuser, while still addressing the underlying concern. Let me show you how this works in practice. Imagine you're waiting for an important document from a colleague, and it's late for the third time this month. Your instinct might be to ask, "Why can't you just send things on time?" But consider how differently the conversation might go if instead you said, "I've noticed the document has arrived later than the agreed time. I'm curious if there are obstacles I'm not aware of." The first approach almost guarantees defensiveness. The second creates space for actual problem solving. Maybe they're waiting on information from someone else. Perhaps they're overwhelmed with competing priorities. Or maybe they don't fully understand the importance of the timeline. None of these possibilities can emerge in a productive way if they're busy defending themselves against your accusation. I remember working with a team where a manager was constantly frustrated with a particular team member's late reports. Every conversation began with some version of, "Why can't you just follow the deadline like everyone else?" The responses were predictably defensive, and nothing changed for months. When we shifted to, "I notice the reports have been coming in after our agreed deadline. I'm curious what challenges you're facing with the timeline," something remarkable happened. The team member explained a technical issue that was causing delays, something easily fixable that had never emerged in the previous confrontational conversations. The Stoics recognized that our initial interpretations of others' behaviors are often distorted by our own frustrations. Epictetus taught his students, "When someone provokes you, remember that it is your own opinion that provokes you. Try not to be carried away by the appearance of things." In modern terms, this means questioning our assumption that others are deliberately making things difficult. This doesn't mean ignoring problematic behaviors or abandoning expectations. It simply means approaching the situation with genuine curiosity rather than accusatory assumptions. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, how much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it? The momentary satisfaction of a pointed, "Why can't you just" question creates far more problems than it solves. Try this practical challenge. For the next 24 hours, eliminate "why can't you just" from your vocabulary completely. Replace each instance with "I'm curious about" or "help me understand." Notice how differently people respond to you. The shift is often immediate and remarkable. This technique is particularly powerful in parent-child relationships. When a parent shifts from "Why can't you just keep your room clean?" to "I'm curious what makes it challenging to keep things organized in here," they often discover unexpected obstacles, from inadequate storage to overwhelming homework schedules. The curiosity approach creates space for collaborative problem solving rather than power struggles. Similarly, in romantic relationships, this shift can break entrenched patterns of criticism and defensiveness. Rather than "Why can't you just be more affectionate?" try, "I'm curious about how you prefer to express and receive affection." This opens a genuine exploration rather than implying a deliberate withholding of something that should be simple. The Stoics understood something profound about human behavior. We are all doing what makes sense to us, given our current understanding and circumstances. When someone isn't doing what seems simple to you, it's not because they're deliberately being difficult. It's because they're operating from a different set of constraints, priorities, or understandings than you are. Epictetus captured this perfectly when he said, "When you are offended at any man's fault, Turn to yourself and study your own failings, then you will forget your anger. This isn't about excusing problematic behavior. It's about approaching it with the understanding that there's always more to the story than is immediately apparent to us. What's fascinating about this technique is how it transforms not just the conversation, but your own internal experience. When you shift from "why can't they just" to "I wonder what challenges they're facing," you move from frustration to curiosity in your own mind. This emotional shift is as beneficial for your well-being as it is for the conversation. Marcus Aurelius practiced this shift deliberately, writing to himself, "When you wake in the morning, think, 'Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. But I have seen the nature of good and know it is beautiful, and the nature of evil and know it is ugly. None of these can harm me, for no one can force me to hold the wrong opinion about them." This practice of questioning our interpretations connects to what the Stoics called the discipline of assent, carefully examining our automatic judgments before accepting them as true. When you catch yourself thinking, "They should be able to just," that's your cue to pause and question whether the situation is really as simple as it appears to you. In workplace settings, this shift is particularly valuable for leaders. When a manager asks, "Why can't you just meet the targets?" they create defensiveness rather than engagement. But when they ask, "What obstacles are you encountering in reaching these targets?" they position themselves as a resource rather than a critic, without abandoning the expectation of performance. Remember that genuine curiosity isn't a manipulative technique. It must come from an authentic recognition that your perspective is limited. You genuinely don't know all the factors influencing someone else's behavior. This humility opens the door to discoveries that could never emerge through accusatory questioning. As you practice this approach, you'll find that it becomes more natural over time. What begins as a conscious effort to replace accusatory questions with curious ones eventually becomes your default way of engaging with challenges. This shift represents what the Stoics called progress, prokop, the gradual transformation of character through consistent practice. The most powerful aspect of this transformation is how it affects not just how others respond to you, but how you experience the world. When you replace "Why can't people just drive properly?" with "I wonder what that driver might be dealing with today," you transform your own experience of traffic. When you shift from "Why can't my coworker just communicate clearly?" to "I'm curious what communication style works best for them," you create space for adaptation rather than frustration. This doesn't mean abandoning standards or accepting harmful behavior. The Stoics were clear that we should work to improve what lies within our control, including clearly expressing our needs and boundaries. But we do this most effectively when we approach from curiosity rather than accusation. Think about a recurring frustration in your life right now, a situation where you find yourself thinking, "Why can't they just?" How might that situation transform if you approached with genuine curiosity about the challenges or perspectives you might not be seeing? Take a moment to formulate a curious question you could ask instead of your usual accusatory one. By making this shift, you're not just improving a conversation. You're practicing what Marcus Aurelius called the art of living, responding to life's challenges with wisdom rather than reactive judgment. You're creating space for solutions that may never emerge through accusation. But there's another phrase that positions you as the authority on someone else's life, which rarely goes well. Even when your advice is sound, the delivery creates resistance. This phrase is, "You should." Marcus Aurelius practiced what I call the ownership principle, recognizing that each person must own their own choices. He wrote, "Don't go on discussing what a good person should be. Just be one." But there's another phrase that positions you as the authority on someone else's life, which rarely goes well. Even when your advice is sound, the delivery creates resistance. This phrase is, "You should." Marcus Aurelius practiced what I call the ownership principle, recognizing that each person must own their own choices. He wrote, "Don't go on discussing what a good person should be. Just be one." Have you ever offered someone perfectly reasonable advice, only to watch them do exactly the opposite? Perhaps you told a friend, "You should really leave that toxic relationship," or informed a colleague, "You should organize your files better." Despite your good intentions, they not only ignored your wisdom, but seemed almost determined to do the opposite. What went wrong? The culprit is likely that small but mighty word, should. This seemingly innocuous term carries an enormous psychological burden. When you tell someone they should do something, you're implicitly positioning yourself as the authority on their life, the one who knows better than they do about their own circumstances, capabilities, and priorities. Epictetus, who rose from slavery to become one of history's most influential philosophers, was particularly sensitive to this dynamic. Having experienced life without autonomy, he understood the fundamental human need for self-determination. "No man is free who is not master of himself," he taught his students. When we use should statements with others, we're subtly attempting to master them rather than respecting their autonomy. This doesn't mean we can't share wisdom or offer guidance. The issue lies not in the content of our advice, but in how we deliver it. This is where the ownership principle becomes transformative. Instead of telling others what they should do, we can share our own experience and allow them to determine its relevance to their situation. Consider the difference between these approaches. You should exercise more. I've found that regular exercise helps me feel more energetic. What kinds of physical activity do you enjoy? The first statement positions you as the authority on their health and implies they're failing at something important. The second shares your experience while respecting their autonomy to make their own choices. The content is similar, but the impact couldn't be more different. Let's try a quick exercise. Think of a should statement you've used recently with someone in your life. How could you rephrase it using the ownership principle? Take a moment to rewrite that statement, shifting from telling them what to do to sharing your experience and asking about theirs. The Stoics understood something fundamental about human psychology that modern research has confirmed. We are wired to resist external control. Psychologists call this reactance, the instinctive resistance we feel when our sense of autonomy is threatened. When someone tells us what we should do, our brain often responds by generating arguments against that very action, even if we might have chosen it independently. This explains why well-intentioned advice often backfires. The moment you say, "You should quit that job," the other person's mind begins cataloging all the reasons they can't or shouldn't. By contrast, when you say, "When I was in a similar situation, changing environments made a big difference for me. What options have you considered?" You invite reflection rather than resistance. I worked with a client, let's call her Jennifer, who transformed her relationship with her teenage son by eliminating should statements. Their conversations had become predictable power struggles. "You should study harder," followed by eye-rolling and door-slamming. When she shifted to, "I'm concerned about your grades and wonder what might help you feel more engaged with your studies," something remarkable happened. Her son actually began talking about his struggles with certain subjects and his frustration with teaching methods. A pathway to actual solutions emerged where previously there had only been conflict. Marcus Aurelius, despite being emperor of Rome, frequently reminded himself not to dictate others' choices. In his private journals, he wrote, "People exist for one another. Teach them then, or bear with them." Notice he presents two options: teaching, sharing wisdom, or bearing with them, accepting their choices. conspicuously absent is forcing them to comply with his vision of what they should do. The ownership principle isn't just about removing a word from your vocabulary. It's about fundamentally shifting how you view your role in others' lives. Rather than being the authority who knows what's best, you become a fellow traveler sharing what you've learned while respecting their journey. This shift is particularly important in 3 key relationships. First, with your children or those you mentor. The paradox of parenting is that your ultimate goal is to raise autonomous adults who make good decisions without you. When you constantly tell them what they should do, you undermine the very independence you're trying to foster. Instead, try. I've noticed that starting homework right after school helps many students. What time do you find you're most focused? Second, with romantic partners, nothing kills intimacy faster than feeling controlled or corrected. Replace, "You should be more romantic" with, "I really enjoy when we have special time together." What kinds of connection feel meaningful to you? This invites collaboration rather than compliance. Third, with colleagues or employees. Even when you have formal authority, should statements often create resentment rather than engagement. Instead of, "You should include more data in your reports," try, "I've found that data-rich reports tend to get better traction with the leadership team. What's your experience been?" Take a moment now to identify one relationship where you frequently use should statements. How might applying the ownership principle transform the dynamic between you? What specific language could you use instead? Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, modeled this approach beautifully. Rather than telling his friend what he should do, he often wrote, "This is what has worked for me," or "Consider whether this might be useful to you." He shared his wisdom while preserving his friend's autonomy to decide what applied to his own life. This doesn't mean you can't have expectations or boundaries. The key distinction is between dictating others' choices and clarifying your own needs. "You should be on time" positions you as the authority on their schedule. "I need meetings to start punctually to fit my calendar" expresses your boundary while respecting their agency. The psychological impact of this shift is profound. When people feel their autonomy is respected, they become more open to guidance, not less. By removing the threat to their independence, you actually increase your influence. As counterintuitive as it seems, giving up the appearance of authority often grants you more genuine impact. I've seen this transformation repeatedly in leadership contexts. Managers who shift from, "You should prioritize this project," to, "This project is critical for these reasons. How might it fit with your current priorities?" report higher team engagement and better results. The work gets done not because team members were told they should do it, but because they understood its importance and integrated it into their own sense of purpose. This approach requires patience and trust. When we're convinced we know what's best for someone, it's tempting to try to force them down that path with should statements. But as Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you always own the option of having no opinion. There is never any need to get worked up about things you can't control. The ownership principle aligns perfectly with the core Stoic distinction between what is in our control and what isn't. Other people's choices fall squarely in the category of things we cannot control. We can offer wisdom, set boundaries, and clarify consequences, but ultimately, their decisions remain their own. This shift in language creates a shift in your own internal experience as well. When you stop seeing yourself as responsible for others' choices, you release a tremendous burden. The frustration of, "Why won't they just do what they should?" transforms into the peace of, "I've offered what I can and now it's their journey." Epictetus captured this beautifully. Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. You can make the best use of your experience by sharing it wisely, but you must take others' responses as they come, without attachment to them following your vision of what they should do. There's a practical technique I recommend for implementing this shift. For 1 week, become aware of every time you use or think the word should about someone else. Each time you catch yourself, pause and ask, 1. What is my actual concern here? 2. What has been my experience that might be relevant? 3. How can I share this while respecting their autonomy? Then reformulate your communication using the ownership principle. The results of this simple practice can be transformative for your relationships. Consider how this principle might transform parenting. Instead of "you should study medicine," which often creates rebellion, try "I've observed that careers in healthcare offer stability and meaning. What fields are you most curious about?" The first approach attempts to control. The second invites exploration while still sharing your wisdom. Or imagine applying this at work. Rather than telling a colleague, "You should speak up more in meetings," you might say, "I've found that teams benefit from diverse perspectives. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts more often." The first creates pressure. The second extends an invitation. As you practice eliminating "should" from your vocabulary, you'll likely notice something fascinating. Your advice becomes more effective, not less. When people don't feel their autonomy threatened, they can actually hear the wisdom you're sharing. They might even seek out your perspective more often, knowing you'll offer insights without attempting to control their choices. This is what Marcus Aurelius meant when he wrote, "Don't go on discussing what a good person should be. Just be one." He recognized that modeling wisdom through our own choices is far more influential than prescribing it to others. When you demonstrate the benefits of your approach through your own life, rather than telling others they should follow it, you create inspiration rather than resistance. The beauty of the ownership principle is that it transforms not only your language, but your entire relationship with influence. You begin to understand that true impact comes not from controlling others, but from connecting with them authentically, sharing your experience while honoring their journey. As you practice this principle, notice how it affects your emotional state. The frustration of unheeded shoulds gives way to the peace of offered wisdom. You're no longer responsible for others' choices, only for how generously and respectfully you share what you've learned. Remember that this doesn't mean abandoning your values or withholding your wisdom. It simply means offering it in a way that respects others' fundamental need for autonomy. As Seneca wrote, "The best ideas are common property." Share yours freely, but without the burden of should. The most profound transformation occurs when you apply the ownership principle to yourself as well. How often do you say "I should" about your own life? These self-directed shoulds can be just as controlling and resistance-producing as those we aim at others. Practice replacing "I should exercise more" with "I want the benefits of regular movement in my life." What forms of exercise might I actually enjoy? By honoring your own autonomy, you develop the sensitivity to honor it in others, and that mutual respect creates the foundation for genuine connection and influence, far more powerful than any "should" could ever be. But there's a phrase that betrays our true feelings even as we try to hide them. The passive-aggressive "it's fine" when it clearly isn't. Passive aggression was as problematic in ancient Rome as it is today. The Stoics valued what they called speaking plainly, clear communication without hidden messages. Passive aggression was as problematic in ancient Rome as it is today. The Stoics valued what they called speaking plainly, clear communication without hidden messages. When we respond with a tight-lipped "it's fine" while seething inside, we're not only being dishonest with others, but fundamentally dishonest with ourselves. Think about the last time someone asked if something was wrong, and you replied, "It's fine," when it definitely wasn't. Perhaps your partner forgot an important date, a colleague took credit for your work, or a friend cancelled plans at the last minute. In that moment, saying, "It's fine," might have seemed easier than expressing your true feelings. But what happened afterward? Did the issue magically resolve itself, or did it fester beneath the surface, creating resentment that eventually erupted in a much larger conflict? Seneca addressed this exact pattern in his letters, warning against what he called concealed grief, emotions that are denied expression only to grow more powerful in hiding. The grief that has no vent in tears, he wrote, may make other organs weep. 2,000 years before modern psychology identified passive aggression, Seneca recognized that unexpressed emotions don't simply disappear. They transform into something potentially more destructive. What's particularly fascinating is how this pattern affects not just our relationships, but our physical health. Modern research has linked suppressed emotions to increased stress hormones, compromised immune function, and even cardiovascular issues. When we say, "it's fine," while our body is in a state of emotional activation, we create an internal conflict that takes a measurable physiological toll. Epictetus advised, "Be not swept off your feet by the vividness of the impression, but say, 'Impression, wait for me a little. Let me see what you are and what you represent.'" In modern terms, this means pausing to identify what you're actually feeling before responding. This pause is the foundation of what I call the honest pause technique. Instead of immediately defaulting to "it's fine," the honest pause involves taking a moment to check in with yourself before responding. What are you actually feeling right now? Disappointment, frustration, hurt? Once identified, you can choose to express that feeling honestly without attacking or blaming. For example, rather than a dismissive "it's fine" when your friend shows up 30 minutes late, try, "I'm feeling frustrated about waiting and I value punctuality. Can we talk about expectations around timing?" This honest response creates the possibility for genuine resolution instead of simmering resentment. Let's practice this right now. Think of a recent situation where you said, "it's fine," when it wasn't. What were you actually feeling in that moment that went unexpressed? Take a few seconds to identify the specific emotion. Now, imagine how you could have expressed that emotion honestly without attacking the other person. The formula is simple. I'm feeling emotion about situation, and I value principle or need. This framework allows you to be truthful without triggering defensiveness in others. The Stoics emphasize that emotional honesty doesn't mean emotional impulsivity. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily to speak the truth as you see it, but with kindness, humility, and without hypocrisy. The honest pause gives you the space to find this balance, to be truthful without being harsh, authentic without being impulsive. I remember working with a couple who had fallen into a pattern where "it's fine" had become a relationship warning sign, a verbal indicator that something was definitely not fine but wouldn't be discussed directly. When they committed to eliminating this phrase and replacing it with honest expression, their conflicts didn't disappear, but they became shorter, less intense, and actually led to resolution rather than recurring patterns. The husband described the transformation. "I used to dread hearing 'it's fine' because I knew we were heading for an explosion later. Now when she tells me she's disappointed about something, it feels manageable. I can address the actual issue instead of trying to decode what's really happening." This practice extends beyond romantic relationships. In professional settings, the inability to honestly communicate disappointment or concern leads to what organizational psychologists call psychological air pollution, an atmosphere of unspoken tensions that drain energy and undermine collaboration. Instead of telling your colleague "it's fine" when they miss a deadline that impacts your work, try, "I'm feeling concerned about the timeline as the delay affects other parts of the project. I value clear communication about scheduling challenges." This approach addresses the issue directly while maintaining professional respect. The neurological impact of honesty versus passive aggression is particularly fascinating. Research using functional MRI scans shows that the brain processes direct, honest communication primarily in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with rational thinking and problem-solving. Passive-aggressive communication, however, activates the amygdala, triggering threat responses in both the speaker and listener. In other words, when you say "it's fine" insincerely, you're not only sending mixed messages to the other person, you're creating an internal conflict in your own nervous system, saying one thing while feeling another. Epictetus addressed this internal conflict directly. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and simple concerning external things. Don't wish to be thought to know anything, and even if you appear to be somebody important to others, distrust yourself. He recognized that the desire to appear unbothered when we're actually upset comes from external validation, caring more about how we appear than about our internal integrity. The honest pause technique involves 3 simple steps that you can practice starting today. First, when you feel the "it's fine" response rising, pause and take one conscious breath. This creates the space between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl, who was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, identified as the source of our freedom. Second, identify your actual feeling. Is it disappointment, hurt, frustration, anger? Be specific and own the feeling without judgment. Remember, feelings themselves are neither good nor bad. They're information about your internal state. Third, express the feeling clearly and responsibly using the formula. I'm feeling emotion right now and what you need. For example, I'm feeling disappointed about the change of plans and need some time to adjust before we discuss alternatives. I challenge you to try this for 24 hours. Eliminate "it's fine" when it's not from your vocabulary completely. Replace each instance with an honest expression of your actual feeling and need. Notice not only how others respond differently, but how your own emotional experience changes when you commit to this congruence. One workshop participant described this experience as finally breathing with both lungs, a visceral sense of relief that comes from aligning your external communication with your internal reality. Of course, honest communication doesn't mean saying everything you feel in every situation. The Stoics valued discernment, knowing when and how to express what you're feeling. Sometimes you might choose to process an emotion privately before expressing it, or decide that a particular setting isn't appropriate for the conversation that's needed. The key distinction is between strategic delay and dishonest denial. Saying, "I'd like to discuss this later when we can give it proper attention," is very different from claiming "it's fine" when it isn't. The first acknowledges the reality of your feeling while choosing the timing of the discussion. The second denies the reality altogether. This approach requires courage, the courage to be seen as you actually are, rather than maintaining a false front of unflappable calm. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about this courage, noting that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The discomfort of honest expression becomes the pathway to authentic connection. What's particularly powerful about eliminating "it's fine" from your vocabulary is how it affects not just individual interactions, but the overall culture of your relationships. When you consistently practice emotional honesty, you create an environment where others feel safe to do the same. One person's commitment to truth over passive aggression can transform an entire family or team dynamic. A client who implemented this practice with her teenage children shared, "I realized I was modeling passive aggression and then wondering why my kids weren't direct with me. When I started being honest about my feelings, even difficult ones, they gradually began doing the same. Our conflicts haven't disappeared, but they're now conversations instead of explosions." The Stoics recognized that emotional honesty is ultimately a practice of self-respect. When you say "it's fine" while feeling hurt or angry, you're treating your own emotional reality as unimportant or invalid. Epictetus would ask, if you don't honor your own experience, how can you expect others to? This doesn't mean your emotions should drive every interaction or decision. The Stoics were clear that emotions provide information, but shouldn't necessarily dictate action. The goal is to acknowledge your feelings honestly while still choosing your response wisely. As you practice the honest pause, you'll likely discover something fascinating. Many issues that seemed insurmountable become manageable when addressed directly. The monster under the bed often shrinks dramatically when exposed to light. Issues that festered for weeks under the false "it's fine" often resolve in a 5-minute honest conversation. Remember that honesty doesn't mean harshness. In fact, direct communication delivered with compassion is often received as respect rather than attack. As Seneca advised, associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving. The process is a mutual one. Men learn as they teach. The path toward eliminating passive aggression begins with recognizing when you're most likely to default to "it's fine" when it isn't. Is it with certain people? In particular situations? When specific emotions arise? Awareness of these patterns allows you to prepare honest alternatives before you're in the emotional moment. Practice formulating honest responses for your common "it's fine" scenarios. If your partner frequently runs late, instead of the tight-lipped "it's fine," prepare. I feel frustrated when I'm kept waiting because I value the time we have together. Can we talk about expectations around punctuality? Having these formulations ready makes honest communication more accessible when emotions are activated. As you implement this practice, be gentle with yourself when you slip back into "it's fine" territory. The Stoics emphasized progress over perfection. Seneca wrote, "Often a very old man has no other evidence of his long life than his age." It's not the years of practice, but the quality of that practice that transforms us. Each time you catch yourself after a passive-aggressive response is another opportunity to choose differently next time. The ultimate goal isn't perfect communication, but progressively more honest connection with yourself and others. Each "it's fine" replaced with authentic expression is a step toward what the Stoics considered the highest goal: living in accordance with nature, which includes acknowledging the reality of our emotional experiences rather than denying them. But there's an emotional manipulation tactic that was specifically addressed by Stoic philosophers as a violation of others' autonomy. It attempts to control through guilt rather than honest expression. The phrase, "if you really loved, respected me," uses our deepest connections as weapons. Epictetus considered this the most grave violation of others' autonomy. He developed what I call vulnerable request technique. When you substitute manipulation for authentic vulnerability, you'll see an almost magical transformation in the responses you receive. There's an emotional manipulation tactic that we've all used at some point in our relationships. It's that moment when you're desperate to get your way, and so you pull out the ultimate weapon. "If you really loved me, you would..." These words might seem like a genuine expression of need, but they're actually one of the most insidious forms of manipulation, turning love itself into a tool of control. We've all been on both sides of this phrase. Perhaps you've told a partner, "If you really cared about me, you'd remember my birthday without being reminded." Or maybe someone has said to you, "If you respected me, you'd take my side in this argument." The moment these words enter a conversation, something fundamental changes. What began as a discussion transforms into an emotional hostage situation. Epictetus, who understood coercion intimately, having spent his early life as a slave, considered this manipulation tactic a serious violation of others' autonomy. Only the educated are free, he taught, recognizing that true freedom comes from making choices without emotional coercion. When we use phrases like, "if you really loved me," we're attempting to bypass someone's rational choice and force compliance through guilt. This manipulation creates an impossible situation for the recipient. If they don't do what you want, they apparently don't love you enough. Their options are to either surrender their autonomy or accept the label of being insufficiently caring. No wonder these phrases create such deep resentment. They're fundamentally unfair. The Stoic alternative is what I call the vulnerable request technique. Instead of disguising your needs as tests of someone's love, express them directly and vulnerably. Rather than, "If you really cared about me, you'd call more often," try, "I miss hearing your voice and would love it if we could talk more frequently." Would a weekly call work for you? Notice the crucial differences. The vulnerable request, 1. Expresses your feeling directly, "I miss hearing your voice." 2. Makes a clear request without manipulation, "Would love it if we could talk more frequently." 3. Invites collaboration rather than demanding compliance. Would a weekly call work for you? Let's practice this transformation together. Think of a situation where you might have used the "if you really loved me" formula. How could you restate it as a vulnerable request? Take a moment to rewrite that statement in your mind. For example, instead of "if you really respected me, you'd introduce me to your friends," you might say, "I'd like to feel more included in your social circle. It would mean a lot to me to meet the people who are important to you. How would you feel about introducing me to your friends at some point?" The vulnerable approach feels riskier at first. There's no guarantee the other person will say yes when you make a direct request. But that's exactly the point. You're honoring their right to choose rather than trying to manipulate that choice through guilt. As Epictetus taught, you are not responsible for the action of others, but only for your own right action. This shift doesn't mean your needs aren't important or that you shouldn't express them. Quite the opposite. Vulnerable requests allow you to express your needs more clearly and authentically than manipulation ever could. The Stoics valued honesty not just as a moral principle, but as the most practical approach to human relationships. Modern research in vulnerability from Dr. Brené Brown confirms what the Stoics intuited: that clear expressions of needs without manipulation actually strengthen relationships rather than burden them. When you make vulnerable requests, you create the possibility for genuine connection based on choice rather than obligation. I remember working with someone who had a pattern of testing her partner's love through manipulation. If she wanted more attention, rather than asking directly, she would say things like, "I guess if you really cared, you'd notice when I'm feeling down." This created a dynamic where her partner felt constantly evaluated and found wanting, while she never got her actual needs met. When she began practicing vulnerable requests, "I'm feeling a bit low today and could use some extra attention," something remarkable happened. Her partner, freed from the defensive posture that manipulation had triggered, began responding more generously. The relationship transformed from a series of tests to fail into a collaborative partnership. Marcus Aurelius, despite being Emperor of Rome, wrote extensively about the importance of straightforward communication. If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it, he reminded himself. Manipulative phrases like, "if you really loved me," fail this test of truthfulness. They disguise demands as statements about the other person's feelings, which we cannot possibly know with certainty. Try this exercise. For the next 24 hours, notice when you feel the urge to use manipulative "if you really" phrases. What's the actual need beneath that urge? What are you truly wanting? Practice expressing that need directly, without the manipulation wrapper. The transformation from manipulation to vulnerable requests follows this simple formula. "It would mean a lot to me if, because." This approach honestly expresses your desire while explaining its importance to you without making the other person's love conditional on compliance. For example, instead of, "if you respected my work, you wouldn't interrupt me," try, It would mean a lot to me if we could establish uninterrupted work periods, because I find it takes me time to regain focus after distractions. This approach is particularly powerful in intimate relationships, where love tests can create the most damage. Instead of, if you loved me, you'd want to spend more time with my family, try, family connections are important to me, and it would mean a lot if we could visit my parents monthly. How do you feel about that? The vulnerable approach creates space for honest dialogue. Perhaps your partner has legitimate concerns about family visits that haven't been expressed because they've been too busy defending against implied accusations of insufficient love. Seneca wrote extensively about friendship, noting that manipulation destroys the very foundation of relationship. Friendship is always beneficial, he wrote, but love can injure at times. He recognized that when we use love as a weapon through phrases like, if you really loved me, we damage the very connection we're trying to strengthen. Think about how this principle might transform parent-child relationships. When a parent says, if you respected me, you'd keep your room clean, they're teaching manipulation rather than direct communication. A vulnerable alternative might be, having clean spaces helps me feel calm and organized. It would mean a lot to me if you could keep your room tidy. What would make that easier for you? This approach respects the child's autonomy while clearly expressing the parent's need, modeling healthy communication rather than emotional coercion. What makes vulnerable requests particularly powerful is how they open space for genuine negotiation. When you say, if you loved me, you'd come to this event, you're shutting down conversation. When you say, this event is important to me, and I'd really appreciate your company, you're opening a dialogue where real needs on both sides can be expressed and accommodated. Epictetus taught his students to distinguish between what is in our control and what isn't. Other people's choices, including how they express love, fall firmly in the category of things beyond our control. By making vulnerable requests instead of manipulative demands, you're aligning your communication with this fundamental truth. Of course, this approach requires courage. There's safety in manipulation. If the other person doesn't do what you want, you can blame their insufficient love rather than facing the possibility that they've made a choice you don't like. Vulnerable requests require you to risk hearing no and dealing with that disappointment directly. But as Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The very discomfort of vulnerable requests becomes the pathway to more authentic relationships. As you practice this transformation, notice how it affects not just how others respond to you, but how you feel about yourself. Many people report a sense of integrity and self-respect when they shift from manipulation to directness, a feeling of standing in their truth rather than operating from insecurity. Remember that this isn't about getting your way more often. In fact, you might hear no more frequently when you make direct requests rather than manipulative demands. The difference is that these interactions will be honest rather than coercive, building trust even when preferences differ. The ultimate test of this approach comes when your vulnerable request is declined. If someone says no to your direct expression of need, can you respect their choice without reverting to manipulation? This is where the Stoic principle of accepting what we cannot control becomes most valuable. As you implement this practice, you might encounter resistance, both from within yourself and from others who have grown accustomed to your manipulative patterns. Change in relationship dynamics rarely happens without some disruption. The key is to remain consistent in your new approach, explaining when necessary, I'm trying to express my needs more directly rather than testing your love. Over time, this consistent practice creates what the Stoics called character, not just isolated actions, but a reliable way of being in relationship with others. Your communication becomes trustworthy because it's straightforward rather than manipulative. Imagine the freedom of expressing your needs without the heavy wrapper of emotional manipulation. Imagine relationships where requests are made and received clearly, without the burden of implied accusations. This is the transformation that vulnerable requests make possible. But there's a phrase that uses someone's past statements to trap them, creating what game theorists call a lose-lose scenario. The other person can either admit being wrong or double down on something they no longer believe. This toxic phrase is, "but you said." Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called the willingness to change one's mind. Instead of using someone's past statements against them, he recognized that growth requires the freedom to evolve beyond previous positions. When you master this approach, you'll transform confrontations into collaborations, allowing everyone to evolve without losing face. "But you said you wanted to go to this restaurant." How many times have you heard this phrase or used it yourself during a disagreement? This seemingly innocent reminder of someone's past statement actually creates what game theorists call a lose-lose scenario. The person on the receiving end is trapped between two equally uncomfortable options: either admit being wrong, triggering shame, or defend a position they may no longer believe, sacrificing authenticity. This habit of holding people to their past statements creates a culture of rigidity where growth becomes risky. After all, if every evolution in your thinking becomes ammunition to be used against you later, why would you ever admit to changing your mind? This is precisely what Marcus Aurelius warned against in his private journals when he wrote, "If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake in any thought or action, I shall gladly change. I seek the truth, which never harmed anyone. The harm is to persist in one's own self-deception and ignorance." What's fascinating about Marcus Aurelius is that despite being Emperor of Rome, a position where admitting error could be seen as weakness, he actively cultivated what he called the willingness to change one's mind. He recognized that rigid adherence to past statements prevents the very growth and wisdom that make us fully human. Think about the last time someone used your past words against you. Perhaps it was a simple change of preference. "But you said you liked this movie." Or maybe it was something more consequential. "But last year you said you wanted children." Remember how that felt? The accusation creates an immediate defensive posture, as if changing your mind is some sort of character flaw rather than a sign of growth. The Stoic alternative to this trap is what I call the recognized evolution technique. Instead of using someone's past statements to trap them, acknowledge that humans naturally evolve in their thinking. Replace, "But you said you wanted to go to this restaurant," with, "My understanding was that you were interested in this restaurant, but preferences change. What sounds good to you now?" This approach does something remarkable. It creates space for people to grow without shame. It recognizes that consistency with past statements is far less important than alignment with current understanding. As Seneca wrote in his letters, "I do not bind myself to any one of the Stoic masters. I too have the right to form an opinion." He understood that wisdom requires the freedom to evolve beyond previous positions. Let's practice transforming some common "but you said" statements. Instead of "but you said you wanted to take this job," try, "I remember you were excited about this position earlier. Has your perspective changed?" Instead of "but you said you'd be fine with me going out tonight," try, "I thought we had agreed on tonight's plans, but I'm open to revisiting that if something's changed for you." Take a moment right now and think about a recent conversation where either you or someone else used a "but you said" phrase. How could you rephrase it using the recognized evolution technique? Create that alternative phrasing in your mind. What makes this technique so powerful is that it aligns with how our brains actually work. Cognitive scientists have discovered that our memories aren't static recordings, but dynamic reconstructions that change over time. When we rigidly hold someone to their exact past statements, we're denying this fundamental aspect of human cognition. We're essentially saying, Your brain shouldn't work the way all human brains work. I remember working with a team where gotcha moments had become the norm. Team members would record what others said in meetings specifically to use those statements against them later. As you might imagine, this created a culture of extreme caution where innovation stagnated because no one would propose new ideas that might contradict their previous positions. When they implemented the recognized evolution approach, the transformation was remarkable. By creating an environment where changing one's mind was seen as a strength rather than a weakness, creative thinking flourished. One team member described it as finally being able to breathe in meetings. Epictetus addressed this exact issue in his teachings. Having experienced life as a slave, he was particularly sensitive to the ways we can imprison others and ourselves through rigid expectations. Remember, he taught, that you are an actor in a play of such a kind as the author pleases to make it. In modern terms, we might say we're all evolving characters in an unfolding story, not static figures frozen in our past declarations. The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance helps explain why we defend past statements even when we no longer believe them. When our current thoughts contradict our previous declarations, we experience mental discomfort. To resolve this discomfort, we often double down on positions we've outgrown rather than simply acknowledging our evolution. The recognized evolution technique creates a socially acceptable way to resolve this dissonance honestly. Think about your own experience. Have you ever found yourself defending a position you no longer fully believe in, simply because you publicly committed to it in the past? This common experience reflects our deep discomfort with being seen as inconsistent, even when that inconsistency actually represents growth. In romantic relationships, this technique is particularly transformative. When partners can say, "I know I once said I wanted to live in the city, but my priorities have shifted, and I'm now drawn to country living," without being accused of deception or flakiness, authentic communication becomes possible. The freedom to evolve together, rather than remaining rigidly committed to past statements, allows relationships to grow rather than stagnate. Try this simple exercise in your closest relationship this week. When a disagreement arises about a past statement, intentionally respond with, "I understand, that's what you said before. I wonder if that perspective has evolved." Notice how differently the conversation unfolds compared to the typical "but you said" approach. The workplace offers countless opportunities to practice this technique. Instead of telling a colleague, "but you said the project would be done yesterday," try, "I had understood the project would be completed yesterday. Has something changed in the timeline?" The first approach corners them. The second invites collaborative problem solving. Marcus Aurelius practiced this approach even with himself. In his meditations, he often revisits and refines his own thinking, demonstrating the very evolution he championed. When you have assumed these names, good, modest, truthful, rational, a man of equanimity and magnanimous, he wrote, take care that you do not change these names, and if you should lose them, quickly return to them. He recognized that our alignment with wisdom is not a fixed achievement, but an ongoing practice that includes recovery from missteps. This doesn't mean we should dismiss commitments or promises casually. The Stoics placed high value on integrity and keeping one's word. The key distinction is between holding people accountable for commitments versus using their past statements as weapons. Accountability can be maintained while still recognizing legitimate evolution in thinking. For example, instead of saying, "but you promised to finish this by today," which frames their failure as a character flaw, try, "we had agreed on today's deadline, which was important for these reasons. What happened, and how can we address it?" This approach maintains the importance of the commitment while creating space for honest conversation about what changed. As you practice this technique, you'll likely encounter resistance, both from others who are accustomed to the "but you said" approach and from within yourself. Our desire to be right often outweighs our desire for truth. As Epictetus observed, it is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. When you catch yourself about to use a "but you said" statement, that's your opportunity to practice a different approach. The impact of this transformation extends beyond individual conversations. When consistently practiced, it creates what psychologists call psychological safety, an environment where people feel free to express changing views without fear of retribution. Research shows that this psychological safety is a key predictor of team innovation and effectiveness. I've seen this transformation in families where children previously hid changing interests or opinions for fear of the "but you said you loved soccer" response. When parents shift to "I remember how much you enjoyed soccer last year. It sounds like your interests are evolving now," they create space for authentic growth and communication. This approach requires humility, the recognition that none of us has perfect access to truth and all of us are constantly evolving. As Seneca wrote, "I am still learning, still growing, still questioning." This humility about our own perfect understanding makes space for others' evolution as well. When applying this technique to yourself, practice saying, "I used to believe X, and now I understand Y," without shame or self-criticism. This self-compassion about your own evolution makes it easier to extend the same grace to others. The next time you catch yourself in changed thinking, try explicitly acknowledging it. "My thinking on this has evolved as I've learned more." What's particularly powerful about eliminating "but you said" from your vocabulary is how it affects your relationship with truth itself. When you're no longer invested in proving past statements correct, you become free to pursue what's actually true right now. As Marcus Aurelius advised, "If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake, I shall gladly change. I seek the truth which never harmed anyone." This freedom creates what the Stoics considered essential for wisdom, the ability to see reality clearly without the distortions of ego or attachment to past positions. When you release others from rigid consistency with their past statements, you participate in creating a culture where growth is valued over being right. Think about how this principle might transform our public discourse, where politicians and leaders are routinely attacked for any evolution in their thinking. By demanding perfect consistency with past statements, we inadvertently encourage dogmatic rigidity rather than thoughtful adaptation to new information. The practical impact of this shift might surprise you. When people aren't afraid of having their past statements used against them, they become more honest about their current thinking. Conversations become explorations rather than debates, with both parties seeking understanding rather than victory. Remember that this doesn't mean abandoning accountability or permitting deception. The distinction is between holding someone accountable for deliberate deception versus creating space for legitimate evolution. As Epictetus taught, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. As you eliminate "but you said" from your vocabulary, notice how it affects your emotional state during disagreements. Many people report feeling less defensive and more curious when they aren't trying to prove consistency with past positions. This emotional shift creates space for actual resolution rather than defensive posturing. By practicing the recognized evolution technique, you're not just improving individual conversations, you're creating an environment where growth is celebrated rather than punished. You're embodying what Marcus Aurelius called the willingness to change one's mind, not as a weakness, but as the essence of wisdom. Now that we understand these 7 toxic phrases and their powerful alternatives, let's develop a systematic approach to transforming your communication. The Stoics were masters of practical implementation, creating daily practices that turned philosophical insights into lived reality. I've developed a 7-day transformation program based on Stoic principles that will help you eliminate these toxic phrases from your vocabulary and replace them with expressions that build connection rather than barriers. Transformation real happens when knowledge becomes automatic habit. That's what separates those who merely study philosophy from those who truly live it. The Stoics understood this distinction intimately. Marcus Aurelius didn't just write about patience, he practiced it daily in the imperial court among people who tested him constantly. But how do we bridge this gap between understanding these communication principles and actually embodying them in our daily interactions? Our brains create neural pathways through consistent practice, not through occasional implementation. Think about learning to drive. At first, you consciously thought about every movement, but eventually it became automatic. The same process applies to transforming your communication patterns. The toxic phrases we've explored have become habits through years of repetition. Replacing them requires not just knowledge, but a systematic approach to rewiring your verbal responses. I've developed a 7-day program based on Stoic practices that will help you transform these insights into automatic habits. Don't worry about perfection. Remember that Epictetus himself acknowledged, "No great thing is created suddenly." This is about progress, not immediate perfection. Let's begin with day 1, the practice of awareness. Seneca emphasized self-examination as the foundation of personal growth. I will keep constant watch over myself and, most usefully, will review my day, he wrote in his letters. This daily review wasn't about self-criticism, but about clear-eyed observation of patterns. For the first day, commit to simply observing your communication without judgment. Each evening, take 5 minutes to record instances where you used any of the 7 toxic phrases. You might write, "Used, you make me feel 3 times with my partner," or caught myself saying, "You never listen to my colleague." Don't try to change anything yet. Just observe. A powerful technique for this awareness practice is what I call the 3-column method. Create a simple journal with 3 columns. In the first, write the toxic phrase you used. In the second, note the impact it had on the conversation. In the third, write the alternative you could have used. This visual mapping creates powerful awareness of both your patterns and their effects. Many participants report being genuinely shocked by what they discovered during this awareness day. One person realized she used "you should" with her children 27 times in a single afternoon. Another noticed that every disagreement with his partner included at least 2 "you always" accusations. This awareness alone often creates immediate shifts in behavior. As Marcus Aurelius noted, the first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. For day 2, we practice what the Stoics called premeditatio, mentally rehearsing challenges before they arise. Seneca advised, "He who has anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive." This preparation was central to Stoic practice, allowing them to respond wisely rather than react impulsively. On this day, review your notes from day 1 and identify your most common toxic phrases. Then, create specific alternative responses for the situations where these phrases typically arise. If you noticed you frequently say, "You never help around the house," prepare an alternative like, "I've noticed I've been handling most of the household tasks this week, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. Could we talk about distribution of responsibilities?" I call these prepared responses bridge phrases. They create a bridge between your old habitual response and your new intention. Write these alternatives somewhere accessible, perhaps as notes in your phone, so you can reference them when needed. This preparation is crucial because in emotionally charged moments, we default to our most practiced responses unless we've prepared alternatives. Take a moment right now to identify your most frequent toxic phrase from the 7 we've discussed. What specific situation typically triggers it? Now, Write down an alternative response using the principles we've explored. Having this alternative prepared dramatically increases your chances of implementing it when the situation arises. Day 3 focuses on implementing what Epictetus considered essential to wise response: the pause. Between stimulus and response there is a space, wrote Viktor Frankl, echoing this ancient Stoic wisdom. In that space is our power to choose our response. On this day, practice what I call the single breath technique. Before responding in any emotionally charged conversation, take one conscious breath. This tiny pause creates the space needed to choose your response, rather than falling into habitual reaction. During this breath, remind yourself, I have a choice in how I respond. This practice might feel awkward initially. In our fast-paced communication culture, even a second's pause can seem unnatural. But this minimal delay creates the crucial gap between trigger and response where transformation becomes possible. Research shows that this brief pause reduces amygdala activation, allowing your prefrontal cortex, where wise choices happen, to remain engaged. Try this right now. Think of a comment that typically triggers a defensive response from you. Imagine hearing it, then practice taking one conscious breath before formulating your response. Feel the difference this small space creates in your emotional state and thought clarity. On day 4, we narrow our focus to create measurable success. Choose one toxic phrase to completely eliminate from your vocabulary. Many find "you always never" to be the best starting point since it's both common and clearly unhelpful. For this entire day, commit to catching yourself before using this specific phrase and substitute your prepared alternative. This focused approach follows the Stoic principle of addressing challenges systematically rather than trying to change everything at once. As Epictetus advised, practice yourself, for heaven's sake, in little things, and thence proceed to greater. By focusing on eliminating just one phrase, you create a winnable challenge that builds confidence for larger changes. When you catch yourself about to use your target phrase, substitute the alternative you developed on day 2. If you slip up, simply acknowledge it and restate. Let me rephrase that. I've noticed this pattern several times and I'm concerned about it. This self-correction is itself a powerful practice. It demonstrates both mindfulness and the willingness to adjust course. Day 5 introduces what modern psychology confirms as essential for lasting change: external feedback. The Stoics highly valued honest input from others. Seneca wrote extensively about the importance of friends who would speak truth rather than flattery. Choose as a guide one whom you will admire more when you see him act than when you hear him speak. On this day, ask someone you trust to help you identify your communication patterns. Approach them with specific questions. Have you noticed me using phrases that make conversations more difficult? Or, what communication habits do I have that might push people away? Listen to their observations without defensiveness. This requires what the Stoics called the discipline of assent, choosing how to respond to impressions. When receiving feedback that feels uncomfortable, practice saying, "Thank you for that observation. I'll reflect on it," rather than immediately defending or explaining. This pause creates space to consider the feedback without rejecting it outright. Many workshop participants report that this feedback day provides the most surprising insights. We often have blind spots regarding our most habitual phrases, patterns so ingrained we can't see them ourselves. One person discovered that what he considered helpful suggestions were experienced by others as constant criticism through "you should" statements. Take a moment now to identify who you could ask for this kind of feedback. Who knows you well enough to observe your patterns and cares enough to share their observations honestly? Plan when you'll have this conversation in the coming week. Day 6 focuses on relationship repair, applying your new communication approach to heal connections strained by past patterns. By this point, you've likely identified relationships where your communication habits have created distance or tension. Choose one relationship to focus on, implementing your new approaches deliberately. This might involve acknowledging past patterns. I've realized I often use "you should" statements that probably don't feel good to hear. I'm working on expressing myself differently because I value our relationship. This meta-communication, talking about how you talk, creates context for the changes others will notice in your approach. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily of the importance of repairing damaged connections. People exist for one another. Teach them then, or bear with them. This recognition that relationships require ongoing maintenance was central to Stoic practice, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to exercise virtue. Choose one relationship that would benefit from improved communication. What specific toxic phrase has created the most tension in this relationship? How might you acknowledge this pattern and express your commitment to change? Sometimes this acknowledgement alone creates significant healing. Finally, Day 7 focuses on integration and expansion, creating a sustainable practice for continued growth. The Stoics viewed personal development as a lifelong commitment. As Seneca wrote, "As long as you live, keep learning how to live." This ongoing practice was the essence of Stoic philosophy. On this final day, review your progress and create a plan for continued practice. Consider setting up regular check-ins with yourself, perhaps weekly or monthly, to assess your communication patterns. You might add calendar reminders with questions like, "How am I doing with eliminating 'you make me feel' statements?" Or, "Have I caught myself using absolutes this week?" What's most important is developing what the Stoics called prosauche, ongoing mindful attention to your choices. This isn't about perfection, but about progressively aligning your communication with your highest values. As Epictetus taught, make it your study then to confront every harsh impression with the words, "You are but an impression, and not at all what you seem to be." This same principle applies to our habitual toxic phrases. They are patterns we can observe and transform, not fixed aspects of our character. Pause right now and commit to a specific time when you'll begin this 7-day program. Write it down or set a calendar reminder. Remember that what makes this approach effective is its systematic nature. Each day builds upon the previous one, creating progressive transformation rather than trying to change everything at once. Throughout this process, remember that perfection isn't the goal. Progress is. Even Marcus Aurelius, after years of practice, still found himself making communication mistakes. What made him wise wasn't flawless execution, but his commitment to continuous improvement. As he wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." You'll likely experience what psychologists call implementation dips, temporary setbacks that occur when learning any new skill. During stressful moments, you may revert to old patterns. When this happens, simply acknowledge it and recommit to your practice. This self-compassion aligns with the Stoic recognition that becoming wise is a process, not a destination. These techniques aren't about manipulating others, but about aligning your communication with reality and maintaining personal agency. As you practice them, you'll find that they transform not just how others respond to you, but how you experience your own life. These aren't just communication techniques, they're pathways to what the Stoics considered the highest goal, living in accordance with nature and reason. But what happens when you consistently implement these changes? The transformation extends far beyond your words themselves. Imagine waking up 6 weeks from now, having practiced consistently these Stoic communication principles. What's different about your life? What doors have opened? What tensions have disappeared? Let's explore life after transformation and you might be surprised by how deeply these changes extend beyond just your words. Imagine waking up without that familiar tension in your shoulders, the weight you didn't even realize you were carrying until it's gone. Picture walking into a room and feeling genuinely connected to the people around you, instead of carefully measuring your words. This isn't some far-off dream. It's what happens when you transform your communication at its foundation. After 6 weeks of practicing Stoic communication principles, the changes extend far beyond the words that leave your mouth. The first transformation most people notice is stunningly simple yet profound. People respond to you differently. That colleague who always seemed defensive, they're suddenly more collaborative. Your partner who would shut down during difficult conversations, they're staying engaged even when topics get tough. A participant in one of my workshops described this shift perfectly. It's like everyone around me suddenly became more reasonable overnight, but they didn't change. I did. By eliminating accusatory language from your vocabulary, you've stopped triggering the defensive mechanisms that previously made conversations so difficult. Think about the last heated discussion you had. Remember how quickly it escalated? That's because phrases like "you always" and "you never" activate what neuroscientists call the amygdala hijack, literally shutting down the rational parts of the other person's brain. When you eliminate these triggers from your speech, you're allowing the other person's prefrontal cortex, where rational thinking happens, to stay fully engaged. The science behind this is fascinating. Research shows that when someone hears accusatory language, their blood pressure increases, stress hormones flood their system, and their ability to listen and process information decreases by up to 40%. By changing your language patterns, you're literally creating the physiological conditions for better conversations. Take a moment right now and imagine your most challenging relationship. Picture having a conversation where neither of you gets defensive or escalates. Can you feel how different that would be? That's not fantasy. It's what becomes possible when you eliminate these toxic phrases from your vocabulary. The second major transformation occurs at a deeper level. Your relationships develop greater depth. When you replace "you should" statements with curious questions, you create space for authentic connection. People feel respected rather than judged, which allows them to be vulnerable with you. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Despite being emperor of Rome, he reminded himself daily to approach others with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. When you wake up in the morning, he wrote, tell yourself, "Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." But rather than condemning these qualities in others, he recognized they stemmed from misunderstanding. None of these can injure me, for nobody can implicate me in what is degrading. This shift in perspective, from judgment to understanding, creates space for deeper connection. Parents who eliminate toxic phrases often report that their teenagers become more communicative. Instead of, "You should study harder," they ask, "What subjects currently interest you most?" This opens conversations about genuine motivation rather than creating power struggles. I remember working with someone who transformed her relationship with her sister after years of tension. Their conversations had fallen into a predictable pattern. Criticism followed by defensiveness, ending with days of silence. By eliminating "you always overreact" from her vocabulary and replacing it with specific observations about current interactions, she created space for real dialogue. Within weeks, they were having conversations they hadn't been able to have in years. The same transformation happens in work relationships. Managers who shift from "you should prioritize these tasks" to "I'm curious about how you're approaching your priorities" report higher team engagement and creativity. The underlying message shifts from control to collaboration, and people respond accordingly. Try this small experiment today. In your next conversation, replace any impulse to say "you should" with a genuine question about the other person's perspective. Notice not just how they respond, but how differently you feel in the interaction. Most people report an immediate sense of lightness. The burden of feeling responsible for others' choices is lifted when we stop telling them what they should do. But perhaps the most profound transformation, and the one the Stoics valued most, happens inside you. As you eliminate externalization phrases like "you make me feel," you experience a greater sense of personal agency in all areas of life. You stop experiencing events as something happening to you and begin experiencing them as something you're actively engaged with. Epictetus, who spent his early life as a slave, understood this principle deeply. Despite being physically enslaved, he discovered that his responses remained his own. "Make the best use of what is in your power," he taught, "and take the rest as it happens." This insight transformed not just his communication, but his entire experience of life, eventually leading to his freedom and becoming one of history's most influential philosophers. When you stop saying, "you make me angry," you stop experiencing anger as something inflicted on you by others. Instead, you recognize it as your response to external events, a response you can modify. This internal shift affects far more than just your communication. Many people report decreased anxiety and greater resilience in facing challenges. One workshop participant described it as, "finally taking the driver's seat in my own life after years of feeling like a passenger." This doesn't mean you'll never feel negative emotions. The Stoics weren't advocating emotional suppression, quite the opposite. They taught clear-eyed recognition of our emotions, coupled with the understanding that we generate them through our interpretations. When you say, "I feel frustrated when meetings start late," instead of "you make me frustrated when you're late," you're acknowledging your emotion while maintaining your agency over it. The ripple effects of this transformation extend into every area of life. Professional opportunities often expand as others perceive you as more emotionally intelligent and mature. Leadership positions become more accessible as your communication style demonstrates your ability to handle complex interpersonal dynamics without reactivity. A participant in my workshop who had been passed over for promotion several times was elevated to a management position within 3 months of implementing these communication changes. Her supervisor specifically cited her ability to address difficult situations without creating defensiveness as a key factor in the decision. This wasn't manipulation or political maneuvering. It was the natural outcome of more effective communication. One of the most unexpected benefits many people report is improved physical health. The connection between toxic communication patterns and physical stress is well documented. When you regularly use phrases like "you make me feel," you're not just creating interpersonal tension, you're activating your own stress response system. By shifting to language that maintains your agency, you reduce chronic stress activation, which has been linked to everything from improved immune function to better cardiovascular health. Take a moment to check in with your body right now. Where do you typically feel tension during difficult conversations? Your jaw? Your shoulders? Your stomach? Imagine those areas softening as you implement these new communication patterns. This physical release is often one of the first benefits people notice. Perhaps most importantly, your relationship with yourself transforms. Many of us use the same toxic phrases in our internal dialogue that we use with others. As you eliminate "you never get anything right" from your external vocabulary, you'll find it easier to silence your inner critic as well. The harsh "you should" statements that create so much internal suffering begin to soften into more compassionate self-guidance. Seneca recognized this connection between how we speak to others and how we speak to ourselves. Associate with people who are likely to improve you, he advised. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving. The process is a mutual one. Men learn as they teach. As you practice more compassionate communication with others, you naturally develop greater self-compassion. This self-compassion creates a virtuous cycle. As your internal dialogue becomes less harsh, you have more emotional resources available for challenging conversations. You're less likely to react defensively because you're not constantly defending against your own inner critic. This makes your external communication even more effective, which further reinforces your positive self-perception. Of course, this transformation isn't always smooth or linear. You'll have days when old patterns reassert themselves, particularly during stress or fatigue. The Stoic approach isn't about perfection. It's about progress and recovery. Epictetus taught that becoming a philosopher wasn't about achieving a perfect state, but about making continuous progress, what he called becoming a prokoptontes, or one who is making progress. When you find yourself slipping back into toxic phrases, practice what I call compassionate correction. Simply acknowledge the slip and rephrase, "Let me say that differently. What I meant was..." This models both accountability and self-compassion, a powerful combination that inspires others to follow your example. Remember that what you're really doing is aligning your language with reality. These toxic phrases aren't just unpleasant, they're inaccurate. No one makes you feel anything. No one always or never does something. By eliminating these phrases, you're committing to a more truthful way of expressing yourself. As your communication transforms, your entire experience of conflict changes. Instead of dreading difficult conversations, you begin to see them as opportunities for deeper understanding. One participant described this shift. "I used to get that knot in my stomach whenever tension arose. Now I get curious instead of anxious. It's like I finally have the tools to navigate what used to feel impossible." The words that leave your mouth today will create the reality you live in tomorrow. This isn't just about better communication, it's about reclaiming the power that Marcus Aurelius recognized 2 millennia ago, that our words shape our thoughts shape our actions, and our actions shape our destiny. I want you to take a moment right now to imagine your next difficult conversation. Picture yourself pausing before responding, choosing words that express your truth without undermining connection. Feel the difference in your body as you communicate from sovereignty rather than reactivity. This isn't just imagination. It's rehearsing the new neural pathways you're creating through this practice. The 7 toxic phrases we've explored aren't just bad communication. They're the invisible chains that have been holding you back from the connections you desire and deserve. Starting today, you can break them. Begin with awareness. Notice the patterns. Choose one phrase to eliminate. Practice its alternative. Give yourself grace when you slip. And watch as your relationships transform, not through manipulation or techniques, but through alignment with a more accurate and empowering way of expressing your truth. As Epictetus said, "First learn the meaning of what you say and then speak." Your journey toward transformative communication starts now. With each conscious choice to eliminate these toxic phrases, you're not just changing your words, you're changing your life.